Welcome to this special edition of Experts at Eastern. We're pleased to have, I'm going to practice this a little bit. You know I'm going to stumble on it. Krisztian Magori, PhD.
Right?
That means you're a doctor.
Well, not that kind of doctor.
Not that kind of doctor. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm used to dealing with mental doctors, but that's a whole other subject at another time.
It's a different acronym.
You know, we've been living through, since really the beginning of this year, a steady increase of COVID-19 and all of the things that have related to that. And that kind of covers your background, which is assistant professor of biostatistics at Eastern Washington University. That's a mouthful.
Yep.
I've got to ask you, how did you get interested in that subject to teach?
So let me give you a little bit of background where I come from. So I grew up in Hungary. I did all my education there, and I was a biology major back in Hungary. And I remember taking a statistics class. I tell this story to my students as well, as an undergrad, and really not getting why this is useful. It's like all these formulas, and I don't see how this is anything of use. And then I did my PhD, and I did my PhD in physics, but I'm not a physicist. It was a biological physics department. I was really there because my major advisor was in that department. And so all I did was mathematical modeling of different kinds, evolution, and I didn't need statistics. I wasn't using real data, so I still didn't get why statistics is useful. And then I did a postdoc in the United States. The reason why I ended up here is because I was looking for jobs in academia, and those are hard to come by in Hungary. And so then I applied to jobs in the US as a postdoctoral researcher. And I don't know exactly why, but one of the preeminent scientists at North Carolina State University, Fred Gould, took a chance on me, on just this unknown guy from Hungary, and he hired me from Hungary. And, you know, I'm grateful for him to get the opportunity at that time, and that's sort of how I got to the US. And even then I was doing more mathematical modeling. And then I spent a year in the UK working at a company that develops genetically engineered mosquitoes. That's a different story. And then I came back to the US, and I did a postdoc at University of Georgia. And that was the first time I actually had to use real data. I had to analyze mosquito numbers from New York City and West Nile virus numbers. They had this incredible data set, 10 years of mosquito collections, and I had the chance to analyze it. And that's when I realized, without statistics, you have nothing. There is no other way to analyze numbers. To basically ask and answer questions about the real world, you have to use statistics. That's the only way, at least in biology and sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the story that I tell to the students. And then, honestly, I don't have a degree in statistics. I don't have a math degree. I basically learned statistics on the job. And the things that I learned is what I teach to the students. And then, of course, the best way to learn something is to teach it.
Yes.
So since I've been teaching it, I learned the basics more than I ever did before. And so now I'm confident in being a biostatistician. But at the heart, I'm really a disease ecologist. And so what I'm really interested in is the interactions between hosts and pathogens and vectors mostly. So by vectors, I mean mosquitoes and ticks and things that bite us that can make us sick. That's my specialty. And so that's the research I do mostly here at Eastern as well. I have students collecting mosquitoes and ticks and testing them for various pathogens.
And sometimes it takes a few steps in our lives to realize that something we learned earlier really is going to impact us.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
I love it.
Yes.
It's a perfect life lesson. It really is. And
yeah.
And I see why you tell your students that, because we can all go, why am I taking this class, or why am I having to learn this? And it pays off, maybe not immediately, but later in life.
Yeah, I
So,
mean, 15 years later, here I am
yeah.
teaching statistics. I never would have guessed.
Yep. Well, my first question is, have we made any progress on how the virus, the COVID-19, originally jumped from its animal reservoir to people? And we're assuming that that's how it happened. I'm not sure that the story is absolute, but that's the scenario we're talking about. And have we
Sure.
figured any of that out yet?
Sure. Let me give you a little bit of perspective as a disease ecologist on the moment that we're living in right now. So I remember on December 31st, it was New Year's Day, when I first heard about this virus. And the reason I heard about it is that there is a listserv, an electronic listserv mailing list that is called ProMedMail. And ProMedMail has been around for 15, 20 years now. And what they do is they basically have a network of physicians and other health professionals who report unusual outbreaks of stuff
Sure.
that happens all over the world. And you could get that from Google News or whatever, but they also have a second layer of experts who review these reports, who can filter out, yeah, this is bogus, this is just regular, usual stuff, we don't care. And then those that get through that filtering, those are the interesting ones. And so I've been following this listserv for the last 10 years or so. So I have seen everything go through from avian flu in 2009 to Zika virus, chikungunya, Ebola outbreaks, all these things I see first before they would hit the mainstream media and from a different perspective. And on December 31st of last year, I was reading this report of cases of unresolved pneumonia, infectious disease connected to the wet market in Wuhan. And, at first we were like, nah, who knows? It's probably going to go away. Like, there has been periodically stuff like this pop up and then just sort of disappear. And they're like, okay, not a big deal. However, I'm also on Twitter, and Twitter is really good for following. If you follow the right people, the knowledgeable experts, you can learn a lot. And there's one in particular called Helen Breswell, who I follow, who tweeted out this report of ProMedMail saying she has a bad feeling about this, that this might be the one. So she was sort of the one who first raised the alarm bell. And then, of course, we know the story since. I also have to admit, I was unprepared as a disease ecologist. I was fooling myself in retrospect, up until early March. I was still in the mindset that the Chinese have this under control, which, thinking back, I shouldn't have thought that. This is a respiratory pathogen that now know can transmit asymptomatically and presymptomatically. There's no way to really stop it from spreading other than completely cutting off travel, which we weren't doing. And of course, the CDC was not checking anybody but people coming from China at that time. And so they had no way of even checking the symptomatic ones from Europe, basically. And so there was no way that this is not going to get here. And it took me until the CDC had that announcement early March by Nancy Messonnier, I believe, the CDC professional's name, where she said that people have to think about mitigation, which to me meant this is over. We cannot shut this out. This is in, and there's no way to stop it from spreading.
Yeah.
It's here. There's no way to not have it here. So instead of containment, I believe she said mitigation. And of course, then the CDC was basically shut down from saying anything more. But that was when I realized that this is it. And also, as a disease ecologist, you have kind of ambivalent feelings about it. Like, it's like living in history, right? It's like the most exciting thing that ever happened to me while at this as a disease ecologist professionally. Like I actually live in a pandemic. How many generations could say that?
Right.
Um, Whereas, of course, we know the human toll and the suffering, and that's
Yes.
how horrific it is and how much it impacts all of our lives. Um, and those are difficult to reconcile. Um, and the other day I was standing in Trader Joe's with a mask on my face, and I was like, "Holy shit! This is real. Like,
Yes.
uh, I really live in this. It's kind of like living in a nightmare, but we'll get through it. But it's never gonna be exactly the same."
But for you,
So
it's an opportunity, though, too,
it
isn't it?
is.
Okay.
It is certainly an opportunity, and I also hope that it's an opportunity for the entire human race to reconsider how we live and what our values are, and how we want to continue. Going back to your actual question to respond to that, um, in a way, it doesn't matter. Uh, in a way, it doesn't matter who was the first case. And the index case, diagnostically or in terms of how we treat this or respond to it, it doesn't matter anymore. If we had caught it really early on, then yes, it would matter. We would learn from it, but at this point, it doesn't matter. What it matters is in the future, how do we avoid this happening again? So we do know from the CDC and others have done studies in China with bats, that bats are the natural hosts of these coronaviruses, and they have hundreds, if not thousands, of these coronaviruses in them. And the conventional wisdom was that these viruses cannot easily jump to people. They cannot easily infect people.
Okay.
However, they have done studies uh, since where they actually isolated coronaviruses and exposed them to human cells, and they have shown that that conventional wisdom is wrong, that there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of similar coronaviruses that could jump at any time, really, from a bat to a person or from a bat to another animal that is being sold and eaten and to a person. So this is not something that's unique. It could happen again. And one thing that this pandemic has really shown is that we're woefully unprepared for anything like this. I mean, we're almost as unprepared as they were in 1918 for the flu. We're not as bad, but almost. Like, yes, we're developing the vaccine. Yes, we have treatments. Yes, we have better healthcare, but we still have, hundreds of thousands of people dying. It's not that what we have is not that effective. Um, One thing that I also hope that will come out of this is we will respect animals more and their environment, because the only way that this virus can get to people is when bats get in contact with people. If we leave the bats alone, these viruses they don't have any way to jump to people. Also, if we, don't eat animals that are in contact with bats, so we just need to be more careful and more respectful of the, the wildlife, basically,
Right.
and protect them more and be more cautious on how much contact we get with them. And
I,
we can't do that, just in sort of developed countries. We have to have that as a global
right.
effort.
Right. You said we weren't prepared for this, or at least as prepared as we could have been. What things The question I think of is what else could we have done? You said let's learn from this. Okay,
Yeah.
what if you had been asked before this uh, pandemic,
So,
what would be the three things or more that we should have
sure.
been doing?
So I'm not a pandemic preparedness expert.
Right.
So some of the things I think might be wrong if you would ask an actual expert. But there have been very detailed plans for pandemics before that basically went unheeded. because they cost too much. And it's basically a cost benefit exercise at some point.
Right.
You're like, how much is the risk and how much is the benefit? And so, remember the 2009 the pandemic flu? Everybody was freaking out. I was freaking out, reading the reports first from Mexico City, having lots of people dying. Then it turned out to be that by that time, half of Mexico City was infected, and we were just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and the actual mortality rate was way lower. And then people sort of were like, it's not such a big deal. So that might have grown some complacency. We had pandemic stockpiles of N95 masks, gloves, gowns, ventilators at some point, but there wasn't a decision made to make that, to upkeep that, to maintain those, to replace them. So they expired. You can't use expired equipment. It's just not. It's not a good thing.
Right.
And so that's one thing. And then politically, also, there was a pandemic task force under the previous administration that was basically disbanded. Funding was cut from programs that were looking for viruses like this one in other countries to see what's out there so that we can develop vaccines before we have this situation. So there were a lot of things that could have been done that weren't. And so hopefully this will spur some momentum that as long as we remember these horrible months, we can say, you don't want to have another one of this, right? So let's invest in trying to prevent that from happening again. And hopefully our, cultural memory will be longer than the one after the 1918 Spanish flu.
Yes, and even some of the other things that have happened in the last 50 or 100, 50 years or so, honestly, until the discussion about the current pandemic came up and came right to our faces, I had forgotten about all of those. Okay? Now, you probably
like polio.
hadn't, but I think the average person had moved on. You remember major events, maybe 9/11 and some other things, but going back earlier than that, that was way back in history, if you will.
Sure.
And so we tend to, well, that's been taken care of. We won't have that problem again. I think there's that attitude out there, right?
It's very similar to extreme weather, like 100-year floods. Like, yeah, there was a flood 100 years ago. Like, why would it happen again? We don't need to prepare the drain pipes for that capacity because we're never going to have that storm again. And then when it actually hits, they're like, oops, we did not expect that. I think it's a similar problem. The problem is that responding to that needs continuous investment, which is very difficult politically. Like, how do you justify to the taxpayers that, yes, every year we have to spend this amount of money in case we have another pandemic, which we could. And so we'll see.
Can you talk a little bit about what we know so far about how the virus is spread? There have been lots of discussion all over the place and so forth about mask, no mask, and all of that. And it seems to me, I can't say I've zeroed in on it any more than the average person, but it seems like every few days there's a whole new set of values and things that we should or should not do. And I'm not keeping up with it, number one, and not sure what to believe. And I think I say that for a lot of people out there.
Sure, of course. Yeah. And sometimes the experts don't know exactly either yet because it's so new. I mean, it's easy to forget that we've only been doing this since, for the last 6 months or 7 months.
Right.
And usually you need years to really figure out these things. And we don't have that luxury right now.
Right.
So initially there was a lot of confusion about how it was spreading. And a lot of the control efforts were based on similar coronaviruses, particularly SARS, the first SARS. So this virus is called SARS-CoV-2 because it's very closely related to SARS. So SARS-1 was back in 2003. It started in, I believe, in China as well, and then it went to Hong Kong, and then it went to, if I remember correctly, Canada. But it was not huge. It didn't get as bad as this one. And one of the reasons why it didn't get as bad was because it was more lethal, which is bad. But it also meant that people with serious symptoms were only transmitting the virus. And so initially, the CDC and the Chinese CDC and probably everyone else was thinking, oh, this is just like SARS. So only people with severe symptoms are transmitting.
Right.
Now, it turns out that it's not. There's about 80% asymptomatic infections, and usually we would think that those people they don't produce enough virus to transmit diseases. Typically, that's how it works, like with the flu and other viruses. However, more and more evidence has been gathered and developed to show that no, people have mild symptoms where they can function. Like there was a Chinese lady in Germany who was infected, didn't feel very sick, took some, Tylenol, and then went about her day, and then ended up infecting a whole bunch of her coworkers, German coworkers. That is unusual for most viruses, and certainly unusual for SARS. Now we know better that it's not unusual for this virus. And then also, beyond asymptomatic transmission, there's also pre-symptomatic transmission, which makes it difficult to control because people transmit the virus before they would become sick themselves, like at least a couple of days before. So, when they try and contact trace, it's not enough to ask, well, did you feel sick? And then look at the people you met while you were sick. You have to look at the people you met before you felt sick.
Okay.
And that makes it difficult. Also, we have a lot of institutions, even Eastern. We have to do this daily self-assessment and check if we have these symptoms. Well, with pre-symptomatic transmission, it's possible that I feel completely fine and I go into work and I infect a couple of people, and then a few days later, I do get symptomatic. So these are features of this virus that make it difficult to control. So in terms of how it's transmitted, so initially there was a large focus on fomites. So basically any surfaces that people touch, things you share, like a pen you use at the counter to sign your check. Or spoons or crayons for little kids. And so that was a big focus to make sure that we don't share things. And then with the masks, there was, I believe it was probably it was an unintentional mistake by the CDC to initially say that the general public does not need masks. Because I believe they were concerned that there's a limited capacity of N95 and surgical masks. And if they tell the public that that's needed, there will be a run on them. And then the medical professionals who really need them, they won't have any of them. So I believe there was communication saying to literally not to buy masks, to reserve it for the medical professionals. But then, in the meantime, we learned that there's a large airborne transmission component. And now that term airborne, that's a scary term.
Yeah.
Infectious disease professionals don't like to use that term because it makes people panic. Because when you think of airborne transmission, you think of things like measles. So with measles, if you have a child that's sick with measles, go into a doctor's office. Everybody who goes into the same office for the next half hour is potentially exposed to measles.
Wow.
It's that infectious. This one is not that infectious. I don't think so. But still, there is obviously airborne transmission when people cough and they sneeze, and even when they talk, and even especially when they sing. There was this case when a whole choir got infected in Seattle just by the singing. it certainly transmits through the air in that sense. So there's certainly that droplet transmission, and there has been some limited evidence that there might be transmission through fecal, enterofecal ways, which again, washing your hands helps to limit that. There is now very convincing evidence that masks are very effective to limit transmission. Initially, the message was that you wear a mask to protect yourself, or no, to protect others, because the belief was that the mask, especially the homemade masks and the cloth mask, would not be sufficient to really protect yourself. It would more limit the exhalation of particles. But since in the last couple of weeks and months even, there has been more evidence that it also protects yourself. So there was a faculty at GU, I forget his name. There was an article about him on Krem2 News on how he basically tested that by exhaling through a mask onto a petri dish and then exhaling without a mask, and just showing how many more bacteria grow on the petri dish. And then even my own students, I teach a summer class and I send them masks, and what they did is they tied them on a paper towel, and from different distances they sprayed it with colored water, and just to look at how much the mask would protect the paper towel, just from the droplets that come from the spray. I mean, there's no virus involved, nothing like that, just as a simulation. And it was obvious that the surgical mask was protecting the paper towel. There was no coloration below the surgical mask. And of course, there has been a lot more sophisticated research showing that masks are really effective. And not even just by completely excluding virus particles, but even by reducing the dose. So basically the number of viral particles that you get exposed to. Because if you just get exposed to a few particles, your immune system can deal with them. We have this innate immune system that just eliminates them. The problem is when you get exposed to a lot of viral particles without the mask, then that's too much for the immune system to handle. And then the surviving viruses, they have a chance to make it to a cell that has that ACE receptor that this virus can bind to, and then you will get infected.
Right. Well, I'm not sure whether this information is good or bad, but it's interesting for sure. I'm learning a lot. Let's look at the pharmaceutical side of things. And I understand there are no fewer than 6 potential vaccines approved for the next phase, which would be phase 3 trials. You hear about that, you read about it, and so forth. These are genetic vaccines. Number one, maybe explain what that is. But how are these going to help us, and what do you think is the timeline? Are we on the right track?
So I'm not a molecular biologist, so I'm probably going to defer to completely explaining what the genetic vaccine is, because I only have vague ideas on how that works. I believe they have mRNA that somehow contains parts of the viral particles that gets produced in the body, and then that's what the immune system reacts to, but I'm not exactly sure. However, I can talk about the vaccine development process and where we are. So first of all, this is an incredible timeline. Like, no other vaccine has been developed under this sort of pressure and speed. And like, typically a vaccine development takes 7 to 10 years. And now we're talking about 7 months.
Yeah.
So a lot of that is because the pharmaceutical companies are willing to take a bet on the vaccines that they developed, that they will first be effective, and second, they will be able to sell them. Because if, otherwise they go broke. Mm-hmm. And so it's basically a big, they are being generous in that sense. Of course, they will make a huge profit if it's effective and everybody buys them. So basically the process of vaccine development is that first you have a candidate, that you think might work. Usually there's animal trials, I believe. Those might have been skipped in this case. And once the first phase is just a couple of people, and just to make sure that it's safe.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is, not effectiveness at that point, just to make sure that nobody gets hurt.
Right.
And vaccines are different than drugs in that sense. There's a higher threshold that they have to pass, because drugs we give to sick people to see if they get better. Vaccines, we give it to healthy people. And so we really don't want healthy people to have any sort of problems from them.
Sure, that makes sense.
And so there's a much more stringent limit on, the side effects and stuff like that. And then the second phase is now effectiveness, but in a smaller group. And then the third phase is, again, effectiveness, but on a much bigger group, talking about tens of thousands of people. And I listen to NPR a lot, and just this morning there was a discussion on the vaccines, and they said a successful vaccine trial means that we have a lot of infections, which sounds counterintuitive. But basically, to have a successful vaccine trial, you have to have a lot of infections going. Because if you just have a few infections around, then you won't see the benefit. Basically what you do is you vaccinate some people and you don't vaccinate others, or you give them sham vaccines, basically something else. And then you look at what proportion of them gets infected. If there's no infection around, you won't see a difference. So
yeah, and if you don't know, if you don't see the infections, you don't know if it's been effective.
Yes, exactly. So in a way, we need the high infection rates that we're experiencing right now to be able to run effective vaccine trials, however bad that is.
Yeah.
And so that's why they run these trials in hotspots like Arizona, Florida, Texas, Brazil. They have to go to these places to see what's happening. And then, if it's successful, one of the other things I learned, that success doesn't mean that you won't get infected at all. Like, you can have a successful vaccine that doesn't protect you 100%. There's very few vaccines that can protect you 100%. Well, nothing is 100% to begin with.
Right.
But there's very few vaccines.
The flu vaccine would be a good example.
Yes, exactly. The MMR is one of the most effective vaccines that has been developed. It provides 97% protection from infection if you have all 3 doses. So that's what we call sterilizing immunity, like you won't get infected. But like with the flu vaccine, you still get infected, you just won't develop as bad symptoms.
Right.
And we're kind of looking for the same thing. We're not looking for sterilizing immunity here. We're looking for protection from severe symptoms.
Right.
And so even if we have a 60% effective vaccine that reduces the probability of developing severe infection by 60%, that's great. That will save hundreds of thousands of lives just by that.
Absolutely.
And those people will still get infected, but just won't develop those horrible symptoms. So we have the phase 3, and you have to wait to see if the people who have been vaccinated will develop symptoms. You vaccinate them and then you let them go, live their lives.
Right.
And then see, do they get infected or not? And then after a couple months, maybe at the end of the year, you can look and see if what proportions did get infected, what proportions got severe infection, what proportion died. And then you have an answer for how effective your vaccine is. However, I think there's a lot of maybe hype, I would say, with the vaccine. I mean, people are impatient. I'm impatient. I would love, to
Can
get
we have
this
it by
vaccine.
Saturday?
Yeah, I would love to have this vaccine by January 1st. But it's not that simple, because even once you have the vaccine, goes through phase 3 trials, you still have to manufacture it. You have to distribute it. People have to get vaccinated. And we need to think about who gets it first. There must be priority groups, people who are at higher risk, maybe seniors, people who are essential workers, healthcare professionals who have a higher risk of getting infected. Those are usually who who they are talking about getting first. And then it's a big societal dilemma, who gets it next? Like, how do we even decide that? One of my favorite movies is the movie Contagion. It's a couple of years old. I don't know if you've seen it. It's basically a very similar situation. It's about a pandemic that starts and then it goes through the world, and it's actually worse in the movie than reality is, so that's good. It's a more lethal virus that kills more, even children more. And there's basically a breakdown of society to some level. There's anarchy, martial law, all of that. But at the end, they do develop a vaccine, and the way they distribute it at the end is basically a lottery. And so I think that's the only way to do it fair, to just do a lottery from among the people who are not in the priority groups.
Right.
Because otherwise we have huge fights over who gets it. And
you raise a good question about waiting to make sure that there's an effect from the solution, if you will, the pill or the injection or whatever it may be. Do we also need to worry about side effects that might create, that we solve one problem but create another?
So as every intervention, vaccines can also have side effects, and they do have side effects.
Right.
Even when I get the flu shot, my arm hurts and I might get a fever, but compared to getting the flu, that's minor. And of course, there are some people who are allergic to components of vaccines, like MMR is grown, or even the flu vaccine, some of them are grown in eggs. And so people with egg allergy are not suggested to have those vaccines because they might have an allergic reaction. However, usually the benefits outweigh the risks.
Okay.
And again, I'm not a medical professional. I shouldn't be giving medical advice. But typically the benefits outweigh the risks.
But history's been on our side, that more benefit than problems.
And if there's any medical intervention that has scrutiny over it in terms of side effects, it's vaccines. There is a federally mandated registry of vaccine adverse reactions that is publicly available, that you can look up and see which vaccine had how many of different kinds of side effects, and the FDA regulates vaccines. So if there is a problem, now there is some concern that there might be a political pressure to push this vaccine through so fast that some of the safety guidelines that would protect other vaccines from being marketed might be skipped. Mm-hmm. And so that's why the pharmaceutical companies are taking a risk. But it looks like from the phase 1 and the phase 2 trials that there hasn't been large, severe impacts. I believe initially in the phase 1 trials, there was one vaccine where there was some red flag waved. I think 2 of the patients got reactions. But I don't even know if that vaccine is still in process. And there's so many different alternatives that it's going to be easy to choose one that's safer than others if there's any concern. I certainly would hope that people vaccinate, because I talk a lot about vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax movements in my classes and try to debunk myths that are being spread, because we do need sufficient proportion of people to be vaccinated for containment to occur. So this virus has an R0. So R0 is a basic reproductive number. That means if you put in one infectious person into a group of susceptible people, how many new people will that one person infect before they recover? And that number is about 2 to 3 with this virus. And from calculations, you can tell that in order to control it, you need at least 60-70% of the people to be either recovered, so they went through the infection and they survived and now they can't get it again, or vaccinated.
Yeah.
And if we don't hit that threshold because people are unwilling to get vaccinated, then we'll be in bigger trouble long term because it will just stay around and we'll never
Yeah.
be able to go back to our previous life.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. A lot of very good information. Thank you very much. I have a host of other questions I'd love to ask you, but I also know that we've kind of extended our time. Doctor, I appreciate your coming on. I appreciate what you're doing. I appreciate the research that you're doing and the biometrics that you're following and so forth, because it's only with that information that we can improve things and look at it objectively. And I think that's important.
I'm running my own sort of analysis on the numbers in Spokane, and things are not looking good. The incidence rate, that is the number of new infections per 100,000 per day, it's still trending up. It's now about 30, and we should really get it below 10. And the mask mandate is hopefully useful, but we won't know until a couple of weeks down. I think Dr. Lutz has said, I really admire the leadership that both the governor and Dr. Lutz has shown in the state and locally. Dr. Lutz has said that maybe 90% of people are wearing masks. That might be okay in sort of public setting, but I see a lot of people congregating in private, like, just in my neighbors' backyards even, with large families. That's where transmission can occur because people are not wearing masks. You're having a family brunch. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward. I get it. But, there's small little kids and their parents and their grandparents all in the same environment. More than 5 people for sure. That's just not safe.
I've got to ask a follow-up to that. How, with the number of positive cases, how much of that can be contributed to the fact that we're testing a lot more now?
So we are testing more, and there is a relationship between the number of positives and the number of tests. As you test more people, you will have more positives.
Right.
However, the numbers that we have are way more than what we should have.
Okay.
Based on testing, if the level of infection would stay flat. And we don't want the level of infection to stay flat, right? We want it to decrease and disappear.
Yeah.
And it's not going down. And if you look at the positivity rate, so basically the proportion of tests that come back positive, it has been steadily increasing since May in Spokane. And now it's higher than the state average. It's about 9%-ish, maybe, going up in the trend. And we really want it to go back down to below 2% to be more comfortable. Because the problem is that with so many positive tests, and many of them coming from the community, the contact tracers don't really know who to contact.
Right.
Right? I mean, if somebody comes in, they test positive, who knows where that person got it from? It's not from a factory. It's not, it's not from a nursing home. It's not from a confined environment. Right. Somewhere that person got infected, and
those are pretty easy to figure out.
Yeah, those would be easy. And initially, that's what we had. We had the pasta factory. We had the veterans home. Right. Those things.
Yes.
But now it's all over the city, and it makes it very difficult. And if it keeps increasing, it's just going to get more and more difficult to contact trace, and then we can't control it, and then it can become an issue with hospital capacity. So people really need to take it seriously and perhaps limit their activity further than what's mandated to make sure that we have a solution, especially with schools coming back. It's going to be very difficult. I read it on Twitter. I think it was Dr. Tom Frieden, the former head of CDC, who said it's very easy to open schools everywhere. Anybody can do it. Keeping them open is the trick.
Okay.
Because if you have one case of COVID-19 in your kid's classroom, or, one teacher gets sick in the school, that's probably it. That school is going to be closed for several days, and people will be reluctant to send back their kids in there.
Right.
And so we need to bring down the community transmission so that we can open the schools and keep them open.
Well, Doctor, thank you very much, because you've given us a lot of statistics and you've given us very practical information. I think most of us are amateurs. We think we know a lot, and where things are going. We've got political sides saying different things. Parents don't want to send their kids back to school, and all of that out there. And I think we need to think about the masks. We need to think about washing our hands thoroughly, and all the steps are out there. If we just all...
It's not rocket science, honestly.
Yeah.
If we wanted to control this, we could control it in 2 weeks. We've already done it in March and April.
Yeah.
It's difficult to decide to do that again. In fact, there's a public letter that an organization put out a few days ago, and I actually signed it, that was suggesting that that's what we should do. We should go back to phase 1, lockdown, prepare for the lockdown, and then lock down for 2 or 3 weeks, and then get a hold of this. Without a vaccine, that's our only effective method.
Yeah, there's no easy, simple answer, is there? No.
Nope.
Yeah. Thank you for your time and for your information. I know people watching learn something, and that's what's important. And as I've said with some of our other experts from EWU, I am absolutely impressed with the quality of professors out at EWU, because I've had the pleasure of interviewing a few of you. And so congratulations. It's so good to see that right here in Spokane and Cheney, and to know that we have that locally. So thank you very much for what you do.
You're welcome.
And have a good day and stay safe.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Experts at EWU. We'll see you next time.